I found out my brother is actually my dad's secret child with my mom's sister. My entire life was built on a lie so massive, it took a simple DNA test to burn my world to the ground. My name is Liam, and I'm 25 years old, and this is the story of how my cousin became my brother and my family became a stranger. My life felt like a carefully curated photograph. You know, the ones I'm talking about. Everyone is smiling, the lighting is just right, and it captures a single perfect moment that tells a story of happiness and stability. My family was that photograph. We had the house in the suburbs, the golden retriever, and the yearly beach vacations. My dad, David, was the stoic, dependable provider, a man who fixed everything with a wrench and a quiet word. My mom, Helen, was the heart of our home, her laughter the soundtrack to my childhood. And then there was Caleb. Caleb was my cousin, or so I was told. He was 2 years younger than me, a lanky, quiet kid with the same dark hair and eyes as my dad. He was a constant presence in my life, but with a strange, undefined role. The official story, the one repeated at every family gathering and school event, was that Caleb was the son of my mom's younger sister, Grace. The story went that Grace was a free spirit, a wanderer who'd gotten into a situation she couldn't handle. Unwilling or unable to raise a child on her own, she had made the difficult decision to let Caleb be raised by close family friends, the Hendersons, a kind older couple who lived just a few blocks away. We saw Caleb almost every day. He ate dinner at our house 5 nights a week, went on our family vacations, and for all intents and purposes, was my brother in every way but name. But there were always these little cracks in the photograph. For one, I barely knew my Aunt Grace. She was a ghost, a name mentioned with a mixture of pity and disapproval. She'd send a birthday card with money every year, the postmark always from a different city, Phoenix, Seattle, Miami, but she never called, never visited. When I asked my mom about her, her smile would tighten just a fraction, and she'd say something vague about Grace needing her space, about how some people aren't cut out for family life. Then there was the way Caleb interacted with my dad. It was different. It was deeper, more resonant. My dad had a special look just for Caleb, a complicated mixture of pride, guilt, and a fierce, almost desperate protectiveness that he never showed anyone else, not even me. I remember once, when Caleb was 12 and fell out of a tree and broke his arm, my dad's reaction was visceral. He was pale, shaking, his voice cracking as he yelled for my mom to call an ambulance. It was an overreaction, I thought, for a simple broken bone. It was the kind of fear a father feels for his son. The Hendersons, Robert and Susan, were wonderful people. They treated Caleb like their own, but there was a formality to it, a sense that they were fulfilling a sacred duty rather than acting on pure, uninhibited parental instinct. They were loving but distant, always deferring to my parents on major decisions about Caleb's life. It was an arrangement that everyone seemed to accept, but no one ever explained. It was just the way things were. Caleb and I grew up under this strange shared roof. We built forts in the backyard, fought over video games, and confided in each other about our teenage crushes. He was my best friend. Yet a wall always stood between us, a wall built from unspoken truths. He was family, but not quite. He was home, but also a guest. This delicate balance, this decades-long performance of a normal family, was destined to shatter. The catalyst came in the form of a brightly colored box, a Christmas gift from my well-meaning but genetically curious aunt on my dad's side. It was one of those direct-to-consumer DNA test kits, the kind that promised to tell you where your ancestors came from and connect you with long-lost relatives. She'd bought one for everyone in the family. It was meant to be a fun, lighthearted activity for our annual New Year's Eve party. We all laughed, spit into the little plastic tubes, and talked about what surprising ethnicities we might uncover. Little did we know, we weren't about to uncover our past. We were about to detonate our present. As we sealed the packages and dropped them in the mail, a strange sense of unease settled over me. It felt like we were sending away more than just our saliva. It felt like we were mailing away a key, and we had no idea what lock it would turn. The weeks that followed were normal, deceptively so. The DNA kits were forgotten, replaced by the daily grind of work, school, and life. Caleb and I hung out as usual, our unspoken barrier feeling a little more fragile lately, or maybe I was just more aware of it. The email came on a random Tuesday afternoon. I was at my desk trying to slog through a mountain of tedious work when a notification popped up on my phone. Your Ancestry DNA results are ready. A jolt of excitement went through me. I clicked the link, impatient for the page to load. There it was, a colorful pie chart breaking down my heritage. Mostly Western European, a splash of Scandinavian, a hint of the Iberian Peninsula. It was interesting, but hardly earth-shattering. I scrolled down, past the genetic health markers and the trait reports, to the section I was most curious about: DNA matches. At the very top of the list, as it should be, was my mom, Helen, and right below her, my dad, David. But the third name on the list made my blood run cold. It was Caleb Henderson. And next to his name, the relationship wasn't listed as first cousin. It said close family, half-sibling. I stared at the screen, my mind refusing to process the words. Half-sibling. It had to be a mistake, a glitch in the system, a mix-up at the lab. I refreshed the page. I closed the app and reopened it. The result was the same. Caleb Henderson, the boy I grew up calling my cousin, was, according to my DNA, my half-brother. We shared approximately 50% of our DNA, the same amount a father and son share. The only way for two people to share that much DNA without being twins or a parent and child is to share one parent. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silent office. The implications crashed over me in waves, each one more devastating than the last. If Caleb was my half-brother and we didn't share a mother, then we had to share a father. My father. David, the stoic, dependable man who raised me. The man who looked at Caleb with that strange, desperate protectiveness. Suddenly, every weird moment, every hushed conversation, every awkward glance from the last 23 years snapped into focus with horrifying clarity. The photograph of my perfect family wasn't just cracked, it was shattered into a million pieces on the floor. I don't remember driving home. The world was a blur of gray asphalt and red lights, my thoughts a chaotic storm of denial, anger, and a profound, soul-crushing sense of betrayal. I walked into the house to find my mom in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. The normalcy of it was sickening. She looked up and smiled, but her expression faltered when she saw my face.
"Liam, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost."
I couldn't speak. I just held out my phone, my hand trembling so badly the screen was a jittery mess. I pointed to the words, close family, half-sibling. She took the phone, her brow furrowed in confusion. As her eyes scanned the screen, the color drained from her face. Her hand flew to her mouth, and a small, strangled sound escaped her lips. The knife slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor, the sound echoing in the sudden, suffocating silence of the kitchen. She didn't need to ask if it was true. The look in her eyes was one of dawning horror, of a long-buried secret being violently unearthed. She knew. She had always known. My dad walked in a moment later, whistling, a briefcase in his hand. He took one look at my mom's ashen face and my own stony expression, and the whistling died in his throat. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight with alarm. My mom just shook her head, tears welling in her eyes, unable to form the words. It was up to me. I looked at the man I had called Dad my entire life, the pillar of my world, and I felt nothing but a cold, empty void. "The DNA results came back," I said, my voice flat and dead. "It says Caleb is my half-brother." The air in the room grew thick, heavy, with the weight of 2 decades of lies. My dad's face went through a series of rapid transformations: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a crushing, undeniable panic. He looked from me to my mom and back again, a trapped man with nowhere to run. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then finally the words came out, barely a whisper. "It's not what you think." But it was exactly what I thought. And it was so much worse. The silence that followed my dad's denial was a physical presence in the room. It pressed in on us, thick and suffocating, broken only by the sound of my mother's quiet, ragged breaths. My dad stood frozen in the doorway, his briefcase still in his hand, looking like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, but there was none. The truth had arrived, and it wasn't leaving until it had devoured everything. "Not what I think," I finally managed to say, my voice shaking with a rage so deep it felt cold. "Then what is it, Dad? Is there another explanation? Is there some genetic anomaly I'm unaware of that makes my cousin my half-brother?" My mother finally found her voice, a thin, reedy thing. "David, just tell him. He deserves to know." Her words seemed to break the spell of paralysis that held him. He slowly set his briefcase down, the thud of it hitting the floor sounding like a final judgment. He sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his entire body seeming to shrink, the strong, confident man I knew collapsing into a shell of guilt and shame. He wouldn't look at me. He stared at his hands, resting on the table, as if they belonged to someone else. And then he began to talk. The story that spilled out of him was a sordid, heartbreaking tale of betrayal and weakness. It started more than 25 years ago when my mom was pregnant with me. Her younger sister, Grace, was going through a difficult time, a messy breakup and a crisis of purpose. She had come to live with us for a while to get back on her feet. My dad, trying to be a supportive brother-in-law, had spent time with her, listening to her problems, offering advice. But somewhere along the line, the lines had blurred. He spoke of the loneliness, the pressure of providing for a growing family, the vulnerability that Grace seemed to sense and exploit. It was, he claimed, a brief, stupid, drunken mistake that happened only once. But once was all it took. Grace got pregnant. When she told him, it ignited a firestorm that nearly destroyed everything. My mom, in the throes of her own pregnancy, was devastated. The fight that followed was epic, the kind of screaming match that leaves permanent scars in the walls of a house and the fabric of a marriage. Divorce was on the table. My mom packed her bags and left for a week, staying with her own parents. But in the end, she came back. The reason, she later told me through tears, was me. She couldn't imagine raising me in a broken home, caught in the middle of a bitter custody battle. So they made a decision, a terrible, life-altering decision that would shape all of our destinies. They would lie. Grace, for her part, wanted nothing to do with my dad after the affair was exposed, but she refused to have an abortion. The plan they concocted was a masterpiece of deception. Grace would have the baby, Caleb. To the outside world, he would be her illegitimate child. But to keep him close and to avoid the stigma of a single mother in their social circle, they would arrange for him to be raised by the Hendersons, a childless couple who were loyal family friends and who knew just enough of the story to agree to the arrangement. They would be his guardians, but my parents would be his providers, paying for his upbringing, his education, his everything. He would be a cousin who lived with family friends, a convenient fiction that allowed my parents to be a part of his life without exposing the truth. Grace, unable to bear the shame and the constant painful reminder of her mistake, essentially disappeared. She would send money and cards, but she would never be a mother to him. She chose exile over facing the wreckage she had created. As my dad spoke, the carefully constructed narrative of my life dissolved into a pathetic, ugly farce. My mom wasn't just the warm, loving heart of our home. She was a woman who had sacrificed her own happiness and sense of self to preserve a fragile peace. My dad wasn't just the dependable provider. He was a coward who had chosen the easy way out, building a family on a foundation of lies. And Caleb? My God, Caleb! He wasn't just my cousin, he was my brother, a living, breathing symbol of my father's infidelity and my mother's pain. The story was over, the confession was complete, but the fallout had just begun. The people in the story weren't just characters in a tragic tale, they were real people, and one of them, the most important one, didn't know the truth yet. I had to find Caleb. Leaving my parents in the wreckage of their kitchen was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The air was thick with unspoken questions and a grief so profound it was almost tangible. But my focus had shifted entirely. All I could think about was Caleb. He was at the Hendersons' house, probably doing his homework or watching TV, completely unaware that his entire existence had just been redefined. How do you even begin to have that conversation? Hey, remember that DNA test we took? Turns out your uncle is your dad, and I'm your brother. Fun, right? The thought was absurd, a cosmic joke with no punchline. I drove to the Hendersons' house on autopilot, my mind replaying my dad's confession. Every detail felt like a new shard of glass in my heart. The Hendersons, Robert and Susan, opened the door, their faces full of gentle concern when they saw my state. They were good people, the kind who bake cookies for the neighborhood and always have a kind word. The thought that they had been willingly complicit in this lie, even as caretakers, was baffling. I asked to speak to Caleb alone. They hesitated, their parental instincts kicking in, but the look on my face must have convinced them. They called him down from his room. When Caleb walked into the living room, he looked so much like a younger version of my dad that it made my stomach clench. He saw my expression, and his easygoing smile vanished. "Liam, what's wrong? Is it your mom? Your dad?" I couldn't bring myself to say it. Not yet. I just handed him my phone, opened to the DNA results page. He took it, his brow furrowed in that familiar way. I watched as his eyes scanned the screen, as the words half-sibling registered. His reaction was a slow-motion disaster. First, confusion, then disbelief. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a silent question. I just nodded, a single miserable gesture. The phone slipped from his grasp and fell onto the plush carpet. He sank onto the couch, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror. "No," he whispered, "it can't be." The next hour was a blur of painful, fragmented conversation. I told him everything my dad had told me, the whole sordid story of the affair and the cover-up. He listened in stunned silence, his face growing paler with every word. He was processing the same seismic shock I had, but for him, it was even worse. His entire identity had been erased in a matter of minutes. The Hendersons weren't his guardians, they were his keepers. His mother wasn't a free-spirited wanderer, she was a woman who had abandoned him. His aunt and uncle were his mother and father. It was a complete annihilation of his past. The Hendersons, hearing our hushed, urgent tones, eventually came back into the room. Seeing Caleb's devastation, they knew the secret was out. They sat with us, and their side of the story added another layer of tragedy to the already heartbreaking situation. They confirmed my dad's account, but with a different perspective. They had known Grace was pregnant and that my dad was the father. They had been approached by my parents, desperate and broken, and had agreed to the arrangement out of love and loyalty. They promised to give Caleb a stable, loving home, and they had. They had never lied to him about who his biological mother was, but they had glossed over the details, telling him a sanitized version of the truth that painted my dad as a family friend who had helped Grace out. They had always intended for him to know the full story when he was older, but the right moment never seemed to come. They were trapped, just like everyone else, in a prison of good intentions. Sitting there with Caleb and the Hendersons, I felt a strange new bond forming with my brother. We were two survivors of the same shipwreck, clinging to a piece of driftwood in a vast, angry ocean. Our shared trauma was a bizarre, powerful connection. We looked at each other, and for the first time, we truly saw each other. Not as cousins with a weird family dynamic, but as brothers. A decision formed between us, unspoken but absolute.
We had to find her. We had to find Grace. We had to hear it from her. Using the old return addresses from her birthday cards and a bit of online searching, we tracked her down. She was living in a small, quiet town in coastal Oregon, a world away from the life she had left behind. We booked 2 flights for the following weekend. We were going to get the final piece of the puzzle. We were going to confront our mother. The flight to Oregon was silent. Caleb and I sat side by side, staring out the window at the clouds below, each lost in our own private storm. The anger and betrayal that had fueled me for the past week had begun to cool, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. I wasn't just going to confront the woman who had an affair with my father. I was going to meet the mother who had given my brother away. The complexity of it was staggering. There were no heroes in this story, only victims and perpetrators, and sometimes the same person was both. We rented a car and drove to the address we'd found, a small, tidy bungalow with a garden overflowing with flowers. It looked peaceful, a place of healing. A woman with graying dark hair pulled back in a loose bun was kneeling in the garden, tending to a rosebush. She looked up as we approached, her eyes, so like Caleb's and my dad's, widening in recognition and fear. She knew who we were. There was no mistaking it. She stood up, wiping her dirt-caked hands on her jeans, her face a canvas of decades of regret. "Caleb," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Then her eyes moved to me. "And Liam, you know." The conversation that followed wasn't the explosive confrontation I had been bracing for. It was quiet, heavy, and profoundly sad. Grace invited us inside, her hands trembling as she poured us glasses of iced tea. She told us her side of the story, and it mirrored my dad's in every factual detail, but the emotional landscape was entirely different. She didn't make excuses. She took full responsibility for the affair, calling it the single most selfish act of her life. She described the suffocating shame, the way her own sister had looked at her with a mixture of pity and hatred that she couldn't bear. She told us that giving up Caleb was the hardest thing she had ever done, but she believed it was for the best. She couldn't raise him, not without tainting his life with the shadow of how he was conceived. And she couldn't stay, not just in the same town, not in the same state. She had to run, not just from the situation, but from herself. She showed us a photo album filled with pictures of Caleb that the Hendersons had sent her over the years. His first day of school, his soccer games, his high school graduation. She had watched him grow up from a distance, a ghost in his life, loving him silently from 1,000 miles away. The pain in her eyes was raw and real. She wasn't a monster. She was a broken woman who had made a terrible mistake and had been living with the consequences ever since. There was no forgiveness to be had, not in the traditional sense, but there was understanding. We saw her not as the villain of our story, but as another one of its victims. Leaving Grace's house felt different than leaving my parents' home. There was a sense of closure, however painful. The final piece of the puzzle had been fitted into place, and the picture, while ugly and tragic, was finally complete. Caleb and I drove back to the airport in a new kind of silence, one filled not with anger, but with a weary acceptance. The lie was dead. Now we had to figure out how to live in the truth. There was no happy ending waiting for us back home. My parents' marriage was on life support, held together by a fragile thread of habit and a shared desire to see me and Caleb through the fallout. Caleb moved out of the Hendersons' house and into his own apartment. We were building a relationship from scratch, 2 strangers who happened to share a name and a history. It was awkward, sometimes painful, but it was real. We were brothers, and we were figuring out what that meant, one day at a time. The perfect photograph of my family was gone forever, replaced by a messy, complicated, and honest reality. Some secrets are buried for a reason, but when they're dug up, they don't just destroy the past, they force you to build a new future. And ours was just beginning.